Hello, so we are going to be talking about the skeleton in detail, and you'll remember that the skeleton consists of the bones, but it also, part of our skeleton is cartilaginous. So we have, like, for example, hyaline cartilage in the skeleton. We also have ligaments, and so we could say that the skeleton is made of, in the adult, bones, cartilage, and ligaments. You'll remember from our discussion of connective tissue that dense regular connective tissue is an example of that would be the ligaments. And these are what connect bone to bone. Now, when we talk about the skeleton, we can talk about articulations. So this is where bones come together. And this is what comprises joints. However, I want to point out that we are going to be talking about the joints in another chapter. So to this chapter, we're talking about just like, for example, what bone does the humerus articulate with at the proximal end, for example, and that would be the scapula. So we're going to talk more about those joints in the next chapter. One of the things that we can talk about are the bones in the body, but we also need to talk about bone markings. Bone markings are parts of the bones, and they comprise kind of like the geography of your bone. And so you need to distinguish between those two. So for example, I could be asking for a specific bone, or I could be asking for a bone marking. When we talk about markings, we can talk about some examples. We could talk about a head, right? That tends to be like a round, prominent surface, like the head of the femur. We could talk about facets. These tend to be flat, articulating surfaces. And so we'll talk about the facet joints, for example, between the vertebrae. We could talk about processes, and these are things that stick out from the bone. So we can talk about, say, for example, the transverse processes of the vertebrae. We can also talk about spines. That's a type of process. So we could talk about the spine on your scapula. We could also talk about the spine on your vertebrae. We could talk about foramen, and foramen are holes. And so we have running down through the middle of our vertebral column, the vertebral foramen. And this is where the spinal cord runs and resides and how it is protected by the vertebrae. We could also talk about fossa, and these are like shallow indentations. So a shallow indentation, like the temporal fossa, actually articulates with the condyle on your mandible to make up what is referred to as the temporomandibular joint, or the TMJ. We can also talk about meatus, and a meatus is the opening to a canal. And so we could talk about in the skull, for example, we have the external acoustic meatus, and that is the opening of your ear canal. That's not the cartilage part, but that's actually, like, if we look at the skull, we can actually see there's a hole in the skull that then goes into the middle ear and into the inner ear region. And we could also talk about, say, for example, a sinus, like we see in the skull. And these are air-filled spaces within the bones. And these sinuses actually, in our skull, actually function to humidify our air, to trap debris, and it actually gives our skull, kind of makes it a little bit lighter. So these are some important examples of bone markings. This is not all of them, but we will talk about more about these bone markings as we go through our discussion of the skeletal system. Now, you remember that our skeletal system is arranged in terms of the axial skeleton and then the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton forms the longitudinal direction of our body, and it also provides protection and support. So we could talk about this skull here as providing protection for our brain. Specifically, this part is called the cranium. Then we have the facial bones. Then we have the cervical vertebrae, and the cervical vertebrae provide protection for our spinal cord. We have the thoracic cage. So sitting in here, we have the lungs on each side and the heart in the middle. And then underneath, we have the diaphragm. Then we have the rest of the vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum. This is actually fused vertebrae. And this is what is going to articulate with the pelvic girdle. So the axial skeleton is what is observed here in blue, and the rest of it is what is referred to as the appendicular skeleton. So you need to know what bones are part of the axial skeleton and what bones are part of the appendicular skeleton. So let's look at, in the back here, same thing. This is the scapula, is actually part of your pectoral girdle. The scapula and the clavicle, this is commonly referred to as the shoulder blade. And if we look at some of the bone markings that I was talking about, so this is the spine on the scapula. We could see that there is, for example, spinal processes on your vertebrae. We could talk about the foramen in the sacrum, those holes. We could also talk about the facet joints between the vertebrae. And actually, there's also in the thoracic part of your vertebrae, there's actually facet joints that articulate with the rib cage. And so these are some examples of the processes that we will be talking about. You can also see here that in some places of the skull, there's actually these rough areas. And when we see roughness, those tend to be areas where muscles attach. So like your neck muscles attach to the back, the occipital region of your skull. And then this is actually a process called the mastoid process, which you have a big, large neck muscle that allows you to take your chin towards your chest. And that attaches to that. That's called the sternoclavicular, not sternoclavicular, that's the sternomastoid muscle right there. Yeah. Okay.